It was mid-June 2014 in Highland Springs, a small blue-collar town about 4 miles outside of Richmond, Virginia. By 3 p.m. that day, it would be hot, 91 degrees Fahrenheit. But right then, at 6:30 in the morning, it was cool. With the sun fully visible in the sky, 16-year-old Martre Coles watched from the living room window of his family's single-story plain white house as his father climbed into his car, turned on his engine, and drove off to work. After he was gone, Martre left the window and walked through the empty house to his bedroom. Once inside, he sat down at his desk, he opened his sketchbook, and he started to draw. Unlike his usual artwork, which consisted of anime-stylized faces and figures full of color, energy, and movement, the faces that he drew that morning were done in thick black marker and were angry and sad. He drew X's instead of eyes, and he put slash marks where the mouths should go. A few minutes later, Martre put down the marker, he put his face in his hands, and he started to cry. 5 days earlier, on June 14th, 2014, Martre's beloved mother, 42-year-old Karina Coles, had died unexpectedly following complications from what was supposed to be routine hip surgery. Martre was beyond devastated. Over the last few years, he had become very close with his mother, as he was the last child of 8 siblings to still be living at home with the parents. His father, Maurice, had always been very hard on him, but his mother had always been his #1 cheerleader, always encouraging him to keep a portfolio of the video game characters and intricately illustrated storylines that he loved to create. She told him she was certain his artwork skills would land him a great job someday. And even though Martre didn't always feel as confident in himself as she did, it was nice to hear her say things like that. With his mother's funeral just 2 days away, the only thing keeping Martre going was the thought that his mom would never want him to just give up or to give in to the crushing depression and sadness he was feeling. And so Martre lifted his face out of his hands, he wiped away his tears, then he ripped the angry, sad drawings he had just made out of his sketchbook and he balled it up and he threw it in the trash. He wished he could talk to his dad about how terrible he was feeling right now, but he knew his dad wouldn't want to listen. He never did. Martre's father barely spoke to him, and whenever he did, it was almost always to be critical of him. As Martre sat there motionless in his desk seat, he suddenly hoped that his father's friend, a 45-year-old woman named Denise Gay, wouldn't be coming by again that night. Denise worked with Martre's dad at a food packaging company called Smithfield Foods. She had 2 children of her own, a 9-year-old little girl and a 19-year-old daughter who lived on her own 90 minutes away. Martre had no issue with Denise herself. She was perfectly nice, but Martre just didn't like that there was this new woman spending time in their house so soon after his mom had died. It just felt inappropriate. Martre had also quietly hoped that his mother's death would bring him and his father closer together, but the opposite was happening. Instead of turning to his son in this difficult time, Maurice was turning more and more to Denise. By June 21st, just 1 week after Martre's mother's death, Denise was coming over their house nearly every night. And in mid-July, just 1 month after Martre's mother's death, Maurice announced to Martre and his other siblings that Denise, along with her 9-year-old daughter Alana, were going to be moving in with him and with Martre. Despite protests from Martre's older sisters, Michelle and Marquisha, that their father's relationship was progressing way too fast, and that Martre was still very emotionally fragile following his mother's death, Maurice had made up his mind. He didn't care what Martre's feelings about the situation were. A couple days later, when Denise and Alana pulled up outside of Martre's house with their bags in hand, Martre stayed inside. He didn't want to see them. But his father began angrily yelling for him to come outside and meet his new family and help his stepsister with her luggage. Martre sighed and stood up and walked outside. He didn't smile at them, but he waved, and then he walked over to Alana to offer to carry her bag inside. But when he reached her, she clutched her bag more tightly to her chest. Then she glared at him angrily, and then she very intentionally threw her bag at his feet. Martre was annoyed, and he looked up at her like, "What are you doing?" But he didn't say anything. He just bent down, grabbed her bag, and then led the way back into the house. Later that day, Martre's older sisters called him to let him know that he was welcome to stay with them anytime he wanted. They knew his new living situation with Denise and Alana was going to be super awkward, and they knew Martre was just hurting from the death of their mother and he really needed someone around him that actually cared about him. Martre thanked them and said, "Yep, sure, I'll come by sometime," but secretly, Martre knew he probably wouldn't. He just didn't have the energy to do anything these days. According to Martre's girlfriend, Ashlyn Knight, who was a fellow student at Highland Springs High School, Martre had big plans for his future, plans that his mother had encouraged him to pursue. Martre wanted to get into the best art school he possibly could, and then with that degree, he could try to land a highly coveted job as a video game artist and animator. And so over the first few months that Denise and Alana were living with him, Martre did his best to completely ignore them and instead spend his time and energy on his artwork. And over those first few months, Martre's art skills got noticeably better, and he started branching out from drawing and painting into the creation of elaborate and beautiful papier-mâché masks. But perhaps the most significant thing about this particular period of time in Martre's life was that after about 6 months of living with Denise, his resentment for her had given way to affection. She could never replace his mother, but she was very kind to him, and slowly, she had become a maternal figure to him. She had become someone he turned to when he was down. However, as much as Martre's relationship with Denise seemed to be evolving in a positive way, his relationship with her daughter Alana was going the other direction. Alana was clearly unhappy living with the Coles, and so she took out her frustration by constantly picking fights with Martre. At first, it was just small stuff like stealing the TV remote from Martre or being loud and obnoxious to annoy him. But eventually, it turned into more elaborate torment. Specifically, Alana realized that Maurice, Martre's father, would always take her side over his son's. And so using that information, she began breaking things around the house and telling Maurice that Martre did it. And every time, despite Martre proclaiming his innocence, Maurice would scream and yell at him and punish him in some way. Alana also quickly realized how important Martre's art was to him, and so she would routinely sneak into his room and vandalize his sketches and his masks. Martre had tried turning to Denise for help, but he was finding that she seemed to be in denial about how badly behaved her daughter really was. Martre also sensed that Denise was desperate to maintain her relationship with his father, and so she probably didn't want to fully acknowledge just how bad it was getting between he and Alana, because doing that would call their entire living arrangement into question, which would potentially jeopardize their future together as a cohesive family. And so Denise really didn't do anything to stop her daughter. Finally, in the winter of 2016, so 2 years after Denise and Alana had moved in, the tension in the household boiled over into violence. Early one afternoon, when Maurice and Denise were still at work, and Martre was sitting on the couch in the living room, Alana slipped into the kitchen, she opened the utensil drawer, and she pulled out a pair of utility scissors with long pointed blades. And then the 12-year-old walked back into the living room where Martre was, and she snuck up behind him, she pulled out the scissors, and then she leapt around the corner and she jumped on top of him and attempted to stab him in the heart. And Martre, at the last second, reached up and kind of pushed her arm out of the way, but the blades dug into his left shoulder and they went in deep. Martre's girlfriend, Ashlyn, remembers the very angry call she got from Martre that night after Denise had cleaned and bandaged the wound on his shoulder and had apologized on behalf of Alana, but that was it. And so for Martre, this was the breaking point. He was furious that his father and Denise had just totally let the situation with Alana get completely out of control, and he was just kind of scared of Alana. That was a real attack on him. And so as he talked to Ashlyn that night, he said to her, I really need to start actually focusing on how I'm going to execute my plan and actually get into art school and get out of this insane household and go pursue my dreams. And Ashlyn agreed, and she encouraged him and said, yes, go do that. And so in mid-December 2016, Martre worked up the courage to go approach his father and ask him if he would sit down with Martre and try to fill out some financial paperwork that would help him get funding to go to college. And as he's trying to explain to his dad why he needs this funding and what he's going to do with his degree, Maurice, his dad, just kind of puts his hand up and says, you know what? I didn't go to college. I don't understand any of this stuff. You're on your own, kid. Martre was kind of crushed because he needed his dad to fill in the paperwork to be eligible for financial aid. But luckily, Denise was sitting nearby. She had overheard the conversation, and after Maurice had left the room, she pulled Martre aside and said, you know what, don't worry about it. I will get the information you need. I'll help you fill it out. We'll get you into college. You'll be fine. And so over the next few months, with Denise's help and encouragement, Martre not only filled out the financial aid paperwork, but he also sent out applications and letters of inquiry to various art colleges. And then, in March of 2017, roughly 3 years since his mother had died, Martre received the best news he had ever gotten. On March 4th at 4:17 in the afternoon, while Martre worked at his computer, he heard the ping of an incoming email. One click later, and he was reading an invitation from Full Sail University, an art school in Florida, asking him if he would like to come take a personalized tour of their campus. The administrator who had sent the email, Sheila Crenshaw, told Martre that she and her staff had been very impressed with the pictures of his artwork that he had sent along, and so they would love to get to know him and see if the school was a good fit. Sheila told Martre that if he wanted to come and do this tour, to be sure to bring along at least one of his papier-mâché masks, as well as his portfolio of drawings. Martre was so excited, he leapt from his chair and he ran into the room next door where Denise was, and after telling her the good news, she jumped up too, and the pair laughed and hugged and talked about how it was really happening. Martre was really going to go to art school and pursue his dreams. After they calmed down, Denise booked Martre a seat on a bus that would take him from Richmond, Virginia to Florida on Sunday, March 12th. The tour was scheduled for the following Monday. After his travel was booked, Martre realized he only had 8 days until he would be leaving, so right away he got to work making a special papier-mâché mask that he would bring along. He wanted to make sure he really impressed the Full Sail staff. On March 11th, the night before Martre was scheduled to ride out to Florida, Martre stayed with his older sister Michelle at her house. They spent the evening excitedly talking about his potential future at Full Sail and how happy this invitation would have made their mother, whose birthday was coming up later that month. The next morning, Michelle and Martre hopped in Michelle's car, and she began driving toward Martre's house. Their dad had agreed to give Martre a ride to the bus station later that day. When they arrived, Michelle gave her brother a big hug, she wished him good luck, and told him to text her as soon as he got to Florida, and he said he would. After Michelle got back in her car and she began to drive to work, she felt a profound sense of relief wash over her. She knew her little brother still missed their mother terribly, and even talked about his own death and how, at least when that happened, he would be with their mom. But finally, this invitation to Full Sail seemed like the break he so desperately needed. When Martre walked into his house that morning, Denise and her older daughter, Latoya, were both in the kitchen chatting and drinking coffee. When Denise saw Martre, she told him that his dad had apparently got called into work that day, so he couldn't give him a ride to the bus stop. However, she and her daughter didn't mind. He thanked them, and then he sat down with them, and for a few minutes the trio drank their coffee and chatted about Full Sail and other things. And then eventually, Martre told them that he still needed to pack, so he got up and he headed to his bedroom. As he got his clothes and his papier-mâché mask and other artwork together, he smiled. In less than an hour, he'd be on a bus headed to Florida, and he'd be officially pursuing his dreams. Since Martre's girlfriend, Ashlyn, had known she would not see Martre in person before he left for Florida, and they both knew that Martre might not be able to charge his phone during the 18-hour-long bus ride, they had arranged for Martre to text her as soon as he got on the bus so she could say goodbye. But at the time Martre should have been on the bus texting her, he didn't. He didn't text, he didn't call, it was just silent. And over the course of the morning, despite Ashlyn calling and texting him repeatedly, Martre never responded. Around noon, Ashlyn called Martre's sisters, Michelle and Marquisha, asking if they had heard from their brother, and they said no. By late afternoon, when still there was silence from Martre, Ashlyn, Michelle, and Marquisha were becoming frantic. They all knew that even 3 years after his mother's death, Martre still suffered occasional deep bouts of depression when he started thinking about his mom. And so the 3 young women started worrying that he might have harmed himself. That's why they're not hearing from him. So at 4 p.m. that afternoon, Martre's sisters rushed to their father's house to see what their father and Denise knew. And when they got there, they met up with Denise and Latoya, who were out in the front yard. And after listening to Martre's sisters, Denise was stunned. She had been with Martre that morning. She had seen him leave. What could have happened? How could anything be wrong? But when Maurice, who at some point had come outside to see what was going on, heard the news, he was completely unconcerned that his son seemed to have just vanished right off the face of the earth. He told his daughters that Martre hadn't even been gone long enough to have reached Florida. It was an 18-hour trip. He probably was just asleep on the bus. And if he didn't show up at school tomorrow for the tour, well, Martre was 19 years old. He was an adult, so whatever he wanted to do, that was on him. Completely unsettled by their father's utter indifference about this, Martre's sisters left the house and met up with Ashlyn, who was now hysterical. After they calmed her down, the three women eventually decided that their best bet right now was just to search the neighborhood for Martre. Denise said she had dropped him off at the bus stop, but she didn't actually see him get on the bus and literally drive away. So the three young women are thinking, okay, well, maybe Martre never got on the bus. Maybe he's still in town somewhere. So the trio spread out all across Highland Springs. They went to local stores, to the high school, to the basketball court. They called and texted all of Martre's friends, but no one had seen or heard from Martre. The next morning, Monday, March 13th, they called Full Sail University to see if Martre had arrived for his tour, and the answer was no. Immediately, Michelle and Marquisha jumped in their car and they headed for the local police station where they filed a missing persons report on their brother. They gave the police a picture and description of Martre, but police told them that because Martre was an adult and there was no sign of foul play, there really wasn't much they could do. Meanwhile, Martre's girlfriend, Ashlyn, who knew Martre's email password, decided to take a closer look at Martre's invitation from Full Sail University. When he had shown it to her 10 days earlier, she had noticed something slightly off about it, but she had forgotten all about it once they had read the good news and were celebrating. But now, when she logged into his email account and opened up the invitation again, she immediately saw why she thought the email was concerning. The email had not been sent from an official Full Sail University account. Instead, it had come from someone's personal Gmail account, a woman named Sheila Crenshaw. Ashlyn pulled out her cell phone and she called Full Sail again. And a few minutes later, Ashlyn's worst fears were confirmed. No one by that name worked at the university. But shockingly, when Martre's father, Maurice, was told about this new wrinkle about the email address and how this meant Martre was almost certainly tricked or scammed before he went missing, Maurice still appeared unconcerned, and he refused to reach out to the police himself. 8 days later, Martre's mother's birthday came and went, and still there was no trace of Martre. Since their mother's death, all of the siblings started getting together on her birthdays to celebrate her life and spend time together. And Martre cherished these get-togethers. So for him not to at least text or call his family on her birthday was very significant. It was starting to feel almost likely that he had taken his own life. But just a week later, everything would change. On April 2nd, 2017, 3 weeks after Martre was reported missing, a man named Larry Anderson was walking in a wooded area near where the Coles lived when he spotted a strange green plastic bin tucked away inside of a thick bush. He walked off of the trail to get a better look at it, but when he got close enough to actually see what was inside of this bin, he stopped where he was, he pulled out his phone, and he dialed 911. When the police arrived, they found Larry, who was visibly very shaken up, and he was pacing along the trail a couple hundred feet away, and then the police moved from Larry to the actual bin under the bush, and when they got up close, they saw what Larry saw. There was clearly a foot with a sneaker on it poking out of the bin. When they removed the cover of the bin completely and actually got a full view inside, they saw the dead body of a young man folded up like an accordion crammed inside. He was wearing blue jeans and he had a dark sweatshirt on. His knees were jackknifed up against his chest at an impossible angle, and his hands were bound behind his back with purple duct tape. There were no obvious wounds on his body. However, an autopsy would later reveal that the cause of his death was suffocation. The medical examiner also told police that present in the blood were high levels of two drugs, the sleep agent trazodone and the club drug gamma-butyrolactone, which makes users feel relaxed and euphoric. Even though there was no wallet or ID on this body, when detectives ran a general description of the young man's appearance through their database, right away they found a match to a missing person report that had been filed 3 weeks earlier on March 13th. The deceased young man inside of the storage bin was Martre Coles. Before the police told Martre's family the horrible news, they received a surprising phone call from another police sergeant. He had heard about the murder, and he had just connected Martre's name and his address to a false burglar alarm that 2 of his officers had responded to on March 31st, which was 2 days before Martre's body was discovered. After following up on this very bizarre connection the sergeant had made, and using evidence they had found at the scene where Martre's body was discovered, police were able to slowly, bit by bit, piece together the story of who killed Martre and why. Back on Friday, March 31st, so 2 days before Martre was found, that sergeant's 2 police officers responded to a burglar alarm at Martre's home. When they arrived at Martre's home, Alana came to the door. Standing next to her was her older sister, Latoya. Now, neither of these 2 responding officers had any idea that there was a missing person report out on another member of their family. Latoya told the officers that she was really sorry that the burglar alarm they were responding to was actually a false alarm. She told them, while glaring down at her sister Alana, that her younger sister had deliberately set the alarm off and she was about to be punished for it. The police asked a few more questions, and then, feeling satisfied that this really was just a false alarm because this kid pulled it, they turned around to leave. But before they did, Alana suddenly blurted out, "Can I talk to you guys, please, alone?" And then Alana promptly stepped forward away from her sister out of the house into the evening darkness, and she and one of the officers walked over to the police car they had come in on, while the other police officer stayed put at the door with Latoya, keeping her from going out there. Once Alana was far enough away that she didn't think Latoya or any of her other family members in the house could hear her, she turned to the officer and told him a story that was so outrageous and so unexpected that it just did not seem true. And so after Alana was done telling this story and had gone back inside with Latoya and the door had shut and the 2 responding officers said bye and they were leaving, they discussed it in the car, those 2 officers, and they decided there's no way that could be true. And so when they got back to the station, they filed their report as usual, describing that this was a false alarm, and then they also wrote down in this report what Alana told them, her crazy story, but they didn't alert anyone to this story. They just basically made a note of it, and then they filed their report with their sergeant and thought nothing of it. 3 days later, when their sergeant learned that the murder victim found in the storage bin was Alana's stepbrother, the sergeant suddenly remembered the report and realized the story Alana had told his officers might actually be true. Based on a combination of Alana's story, along with other pieces of evidence that the police collected, the following is a reconstruction of what actually happened to Martre. Back on the morning of Sunday, March 12th, so the day Martre was scheduled to take the bus to Florida, his older sister Michelle dropped him back off in front of his house and gave him a hug before she left for work. When Martre walked through the front doors into his house, Denise and her daughter Latoya were sitting in the kitchen. Martre sat down, and as the trio chatted, Martre didn't realize the cup of coffee he was drinking was almost certainly laced with the 2 drugs that the medical examiner would later find in his system, trazodone and gamma-butyrolactone. By the time Martre got up from the table and headed to his bedroom to pack for his trip to the college, the drugs would have likely begun taking effect. As he stepped into his bedroom, he likely would have started to wonder why he was feeling so crushingly tired and lethargic. He also was probably wondering why Denise and Latoya had followed him into his room and pushed his door most of the way closed without saying a word. Across the hall, Alana was in her room when she heard a loud shout. The voice was weak, but the words were clear. "Get off of me!" She recognized the voice as Martre's. She stepped out of her bedroom and pushed the door of Martre's room open a little to see what was going on, and what she saw was Martre on his back on the ground, and her mother, Denise, standing over his head while kind of bent forward. She was pressing her hands directly down onto his chest, basically putting all of her weight onto his chest, crushing him. Alana's sister, Latoya, was sitting on Martre's legs trying to hold them down because Martre was kicking her and trying to get up. As Martre continued to yell out for them to get off of him, his voice became weaker and weaker as he wasn't able to fully expand his chest to get a full breath because Denise was crushing his chest. Suddenly, Denise looked up and she saw Alana standing in the doorway. Without releasing the pressure on Martre's chest, she simply said to Alana in an unnaturally calm voice, "Nothing is happening. Go back to your room." Alana, who had learned over the years that it was a bad idea to cross her mother, did what she was told, and she kind of backed out into the hallway, and then a few steps more and she was behind her closed bedroom door, her heart pounding wildly. Back inside of Martre's room, Denise was starting to panic. She wished Alana hadn't seen, but now if she didn't finish Martre off, his yells for help, as weak as they were, might alert others. So while keeping the pressure firmly applied to his chest, Denise looked around and saw the papier-mâché mask Martre had so carefully made for his trip to the college laying on the ground near them. She took one hand off of his chest, so she's still pressing with the other, and she reached and she picked the mask up, and then she placed it over Martre's face, completely blocking his nose and mouth, and then began pressing down on his face as well. Then she leaned forward and put her knee into the center of his chest, right on his sternum, and put all of her weight onto her knee, and then she shifted the hand that had been on his chest up to his throat, and she began pressing as hard as she could on his throat. And so she maintained all 3 points of pressure, his chest, his neck, and his face, until Martre stopped moving. A few minutes later, across the hall in her bedroom, Alana heard the sound of something plastic being dragged over the floor. Although terrified, she opened her bedroom door just enough to look into the hallway, and this time she saw her sister Latoya pulling a large, heavy green storage bin across the floor. A few minutes later, Alana looked out her bedroom window, and she saw her mother and sister hoist this green tub into the back of Denise's car, and then the two of them drove away. After they were gone, Alana quietly closed the door to her bedroom, and then she sat on her bed, and she's thinking to herself, this has to be a dream. This can't be real. But then later that day, when Martre's sisters came over to their house in a total panic, saying that Martre wasn't responding to any texts or calls and we think he's missing, that's when Alana knew this had not been a dream. What she had just seen had really happened. Over the next few days, Alana kept hoping that Martre would just show up, that he'd walk through the door and that everything would go back to normal. But that didn't happen. And 19 days later, on March 31st, Alana was unable to carry this secret any longer. And so she waited until dark, and then she intentionally set off the family burglar alarm, knowing it would trigger police to come to her house, and then she could tell them her secret. When Alana stepped outside of the house to talk privately to one of the responding police officers, their conversation was captured on body camera. She turned her face up towards the officer and whispered 7 words that would blow this murder case wide open. "I saw my mom kill my stepbrother." It would turn out Denise had decided a long time ago that the only way to really secure her relationship with Maurice and to create the family she wanted was to get rid of any reminders of Maurice's dead wife. And Martre, with his mother's wide smile and many of her mannerisms, had done everything he could to keep his mother's memory alive. Even his depression over her loss only reminded everyone how much she had meant to her family. Denise was also worried that Maurice might begin to see her own daughter, Alana, as a liability because of the constant bickering between her and Martre. So when Denise overheard Martre talking to his father about trying to secure financial aid so he could go off to art college, she saw an opportunity to make him disappear from her life altogether. That email Martre received inviting him to Full Sail University had not been sent by the college. It had been sent by Denise, who was sitting right in the next room on her laptop. And before sending that email, Denise had actually called and texted her older daughter, Latoya, and explained her plan for killing Martre, and she asked Latoya to help her, and she agreed. On April 3rd, one day after Martre's body was found, the detectives working on the murder case were getting ready to inform Martre's family that he was dead. But when the sergeant, whose officers had spoken to Alana, called to tell those investigators what Alana had said about her mother's involvement in Martre's murder, the detectives decided to hold off telling Martre's family that he was dead. If, in fact, Martre's murderer was someone inside of his own family in his own house, police did not want to tip them off by telling them that they had discovered Martre's body. Instead, Investigators dug into Denise's background, and they found a long history of felonies, from passing worthless checks to charges of computer fraud that had landed her in jail more than once. Then, under the guise of following up on Martre's missing person report, police returned to the Coles house to interview Maurice, Denise, and LaToya again. This time, police pressured LaToya and her mom for any information they might have about Martre's whereabouts, hoping that maybe the murderer would get spooked and do something suspicious or incriminating. At the same time, police put the green storage container that had held Martre's body back where it was first discovered in the park. Then they set up video cameras to record any activity around it. And within days, both LaToya and her mother Denise were spotted returning to the wooded area where they had left Martre's body, and much to their shock, finding the bin now empty. Police also discovered that shortly before Martre's disappearance, Denise had purchased a shovel, purple duct tape, and a substance called lime that can be used to prevent decomposition of human flesh. But most damning of all, cell phone and computer records confirmed that both Denise and LaToya had been to the wooded park on March 12th, the day Martre went missing, and these records confirmed that Denise was definitely the author of the email from Full Sail University. It was that invitation, the most promising and exciting event in Martre's life that his mother would have been so proud of him for, that lured him to his death. On July 11, 2018, 49-year-old Denise Gay was sentenced to life in prison. Her daughter, 23-year-old LaToya Gay, was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Despite being a less-than-stellar parent, Maurice Coles had nothing to do with his son's death. By 1993, Ludmila Korovina, who was a 41-year-old Russian hiking instructor, came under fairly intense criticism from her colleagues for being too survivalist with her students. They thought she was a little bit too aggressive with how she pushed her students, putting them in unnecessarily risky situations out in the wild where they weren't really ready for it, and at any point she might push them too far and wind up getting someone killed. Her students, however, absolutely adored her. They said on the mountains she was fearless and in tune with nature, and they felt very safe around her. And then at camp, she was very motherly and tender and always took the time to make sure all of her students were taken care of well before she was. Former students have said the mentorship they received from Ludmila went well beyond just hiking instruction. They said she taught a mindset that they carried with them into adulthood, and they pointed to as one of the main reasons they were successful later in life. In the summer of 1993, Ludmila was scheduled to lead an expedition up to the Hamar Daban Ridge, which is in eastern Siberia, and it's one of the oldest mountains on the planet. With her on this expedition would be 6 fairly experienced hiking students that ranged in ages from 15 to 24 years old. One of those 6 students was a 23-year-old young man named Sasha, who, although he was not Ludmila's biological son, she called him her son because she had raised him ever since he was a young child, and he looked at Ludmila as his mother. Sasha also happened to be the most physically fit and competent of all 6 hiking students, and he would function more like an assistant to Ludmila on this particular hike rather than a pupil. The other 5 students were 24-year-old Tatiana, 19-year-old Denis, 16-year-old Victoria, 15-year-old Timur, and 17-year-old Valentina, who she is the only reason we know anything about the horrible things that happened to this group up on Hamar Daban Ridge. On August 1st, 1993, Ludmila and her hiking group boarded a Trans-Siberian railway car in Kazakhstan, and later that day they arrived in a town called Marino, which is on the eastern side of Siberia on the southern end, and it butts up against the base of the Hamar Daban mountain range. The Hamar Daban mountain was not considered a very dangerous hike to make. It was relatively small. It was just under 2,400 meters in elevation. And in the summertime, you'd have scores of recreational hikers all over this mountain range. Plus, the weather forecast for Ludmila and her group's multi-day hike in that mountain range was going to be incredibly favorable. It was going to be warm, clear, nice summer weather. Ludmila had charted a course that began just outside of the town of Marino, which is the town they were staying in that first night. They were going to start next to Lake Baikal, which is the deepest lake in Russia. From the lake, they were going to move north and inland over this stretch that was totally barren. There was no trees, it was just rocks and grass, before ultimately reaching the Hamar Daban Ridge, which was their destination. And at that point, there would be shelter and firewood, and they could take a break before ultimately descending. And so in total, from the lake all the way to Hamar Daban Ridge was approximately 50 miles. Ludmila's group would not be the only group making this particular movement towards Hamar Daban Ridge. They'd be taking their own path, but there'd be two other groups that were on similar courses, basically parallel to them, making their way up to the ridge. And one of those groups was actually led by Ludmila's 16-year-old biological daughter, and they had actually made plans to meet up on one of the last days of this multi-day hike. As they were making their descent, there was a forest they were going to meet up in. So Ludmila and her 6 students stayed the night in Marino, and the next morning they got up early and made their way over to Lake Baikal. The weather's beautiful, they're excited to start their journey, and they take off. And everything was going great until the late afternoon. It would turn out the weather forecasters were just completely wrong, and as soon as the group climbed above the tree line, the temperatures plummeted and it started raining and snowing on them. It was just absolutely miserable. This treacherous weather would persist over the next few days, and it really started to destroy the morale in the group. But Ludmila, she was a pro, and she had hiked in far worse conditions than this, and so she made a point of telling the group that this stuff happens. Bad weather happens. We are prepared. We are trained. We're going to be fine. You need to have a positive attitude about this. We need to just keep pushing forward and not play victim here. And that was enough to inspire the group to just keep on going. You know, they believed in Ludmila, and she's telling them to keep going, so they kept going. By the evening of August 4th, so this is 3 full days of hiking later, they were only about 30 minutes away from the summit. They have now reached the point where they are in the open section of the mountain, where there is no reprieve from the wind or the rain or the snow. There's no trees to block anything. And so it's just an absolute abomination trying to climb this last stretch. Every step is like an eternity as the wind just cuts through their clothes and they're soaking wet and miserable. Ludmila's students were not about to ask for a break. They knew how she operated. She was someone that really believed in pushing through your own pain and fatigue and misery, and she always led by example, and they saw her, right out in front leading the charge up towards the Hamar Daban Ridge. And so they were very surprised when she stopped and she turned around and told them, we're taking a break. And in fact, we're actually going to camp out for the night right where we are right here. No one knows why Ludmila made this decision. On the one hand, it does make sense to take a break and say, you know what, we'll reach the summit tomorrow. We've had a really hard couple of days here with the bad weather. We'll make camp and we'll get some rest and we'll hit the summit tomorrow. That makes sense. But where she elected to make camp does not make sense. She had them stop right smack dab in the middle of this totally open section of the mountain where there are no trees, there's no objects to protect them from the horrible wind and snow and ice and rain that's just going to be pelting them all night. And so some people have speculated that when she looked at her crew of hikers, they were so badly beaten down and tired and miserable that she knew she could not ask them to go any further. And so that was why she said, let's just make camp here, we'll make do. Others have said her map may not have been very accurate. And so she didn't know how close she was to the summit, where at the summit there was literally a shelter that had firewood and a place for you to rest. Maybe she didn't know she was so close. Perhaps she thought she was much farther away and this is the best we can do. But what the inaccurate map theory does not account for is Ludmila would have known there is a forest about 2.5 miles down the mountain, because the whole time they've been on this hike, they've tried to stay up above the tree line as they make this final approach up to the ridge. And so she would have known there's a forest right down there. And if I wanted to, I could go down there and seek shelter in the trees. And so for whatever reason, she decided that we can't go down to the forest, we got to stay here. And so perhaps that lends more credibility to the idea that the group was far more beaten down than maybe we even realize. And she thought they can't make the 2.5 mile journey. We're going to have to just make camp here and make do. But regardless of her reasoning, they did make camp right in the middle of this open section. They set up 2 wet, crappy tents, and they used their little kerosene stoves to make a tiny meal, and then they all crammed inside of these 2 tents and huddled as the wind howled outside. That night, the storm got much worse. The wind picked up, and again, they're totally exposed on this open section of the mountain, and so they're just getting destroyed by this wind. And at about 2 a.m., the wind actually broke the ropes that were holding the tents down, and they had to go outside and retie them, and they were able to do that. And then a couple hours later, at about 4 a.m., the wind actually lifted up the section of the tent that was facing where the wind was blowing, and it pulled the tent up in such a way that water rushed into the tent and soaked their sleeping bags. And they were able to go outside and they put the stakes back down on the ground, but they were sleeping in wet sleeping bags in the middle of this mountain in the middle of a storm. So this is getting quite dangerous at this point. But they were able to eventually fall asleep, and at about 10 a.m. the next morning, Ludmila gets up and looks outside, and she can see that everything is frozen, that it's snowed and the temperatures have dropped again, and everything is just snow and ice. And she knows that, we're actually reaching very dangerous hypothermia territory, and if we don't warm up soon, this could be life-threatening. And so she woke everybody up and she said, we need to go down into that forest and we need to start a fire as soon as possible. And so everybody said, all right, they got up, they started packing up their things, rolled up their tents, and they began walking down the mountain in a line. Although this was not intended, when Ludmila had said we will reach the summit tomorrow, that had delayed their schedule, and it meant they were not going to be able to meet up with her daughter the next day. But now in the morning, when they're deciding basically to abandon the summit and turn around and head down again, they were now back on schedule to meet up with her daughter down in the forest. However, her daughter said she was at the rendezvous point in the forest, and Ludmila and the 6 other hikers never showed. 4 days later, on August 9th, a group of Ukrainian kayakers were making their way down this river in southern Siberia, and they were passing by the Hamar-Devan mountain range. And so as they're kind of slowly moving their way down, it's this beautiful morning and they're looking up at the mountains all around them. The leader of this group happens to see something move on his left side. There's a forest right up against the left side of this river, and he turns his head and he has to do a double take because there is this girl who's standing there at the edge of the forest looking out at them totally expressionless, and she's covered in blood. And she's not doing anything, she's just standing there. And at first, he actually thought, we need to leave. His first thought was, we need to just get away from this person. There's something wrong with this person. But very quickly, the group realized, we cannot abandon this girl. This is a young girl who should not be out here. I don't know what she's doing out here. And so they turned around and they went on shore and they yelled to her. They said, are you okay? And she just stood there not reacting, and they tried a couple more times to say, hey, we're not going to hurt you. We just want to know what's going on. And she didn't say a word. She just stood there in shock. She looked very scared. They finally got up right next to her and they asked her, what are you so scared of? Where are you coming from? And they just could not get her to speak. But they're up close looking at her, and she's got blood all over her. She looks dirty. She looks like she might be sick. And so they decide that this girl needs help, and they had blankets, and so they threw blankets over her. They put her in one of the kayaks and they brought her back to town. Once in town, the Ukrainian kayakers went and got authorities and said, hey, we found this girl. She was covered in blood walking out of the forest. We have no idea what's going on with her. And so authorities came over to speak to her, and although she barely spoke, she would finally say that she was 17 years old, her name was Valentina Yutachenko, and that she had been a part of a 7-person hiking group up along the Hamar-Devan Ridge. And then she paused, and they said, well, where's your hiking group? How did you get separated? This is what she told them. Back on the morning of August 5th, so this would have been the morning after that terrible night's sleep on the mountain where the tent ropes are breaking and their sleeping bags are getting soaking wet. Well, Valentina wakes up and she looks outside of the tent and she sees Ludmila, and she's standing there with her hands on her hips and she's looking around. She looks very concerned. Valentina goes out there and Ludmila turns to her and says, we need to leave. We need to go down to the forest and we need to make a fire. Can you help me wake everybody up and start having them pack up their stuff so we can get moving? And so Valentina goes in, she starts waking people up, and everybody very quickly packs up the tent, packs up their things, and they're in a line and they start walking down the mountain. They had only made it about 10 meters into their descent when Sasha, the 23-year-old young man that Ludmila considered her son, he just suddenly falls. And the other hikers, Valentina included, run over and they help get him up again, and he looks kind of shaken. He takes a couple more steps and he falls again. And this time, when Valentina goes over to try to help him up with the others, they see his eyes are wide and he looks like he's really terrified, and then blood starts rushing out of his nose and his ears and his mouth. and then he just suddenly dies. And Ludmila runs over and she grabs him and she's panicking and she's trying to feel for a pulse and she's checking for his heart. And then she screams out in pain and anguish and she yells, "He's dead." The other hikers can't believe this is happening. They can't even process that someone, any of them, had died, let alone it be Sasha, the most physically fit and healthy one of all of them, including up until a few minutes ago. He wasn't showing any signs or symptoms that something was wrong. He was perfectly fine. What's going on? Ludmila was in shock. She's on the ground and she's holding on to Sasha and she's telling the group that she's not going anywhere. She's staying with Sasha. And Valentina would say the group is just falling apart at this point. You have some of them that are crying, others who are just standing there looking around like, what's happening to us right now? And at some point, Ludmila collects herself and she says to the group, "Go down to the forest. Go down to the forest and start a fire." And Valentina said they didn't want to leave her and they were pleading with her to let them stay. And she said, "No, go down to the forest and start a fire." And finally, Valentina said the group would. They'd get together and they'd turn around, and not really knowing what was going to happen next, they just begin walking down this mountain, and they only get a few steps before they hear Ludmila yell out to come back. She's saying, "I can't move." And they turn around and Valentina was towards the front of the returning group as they're going back up the mountain, back to Ludmila. And she's now bleeding out of her nose and her ears and her mouth. She's heaving like something's going on inside of her, and then all of a sudden she keels over on top of Sasha. And she dies right in front of them. And now the group is in hysterics. And Valentina's in the front and she can't see anybody else. And then she turns around and she can't believe what she's seeing to her side. Now everybody else is bleeding from their nose and their ears and their mouth, and some of them are frothing from the mouth. Valentina reached for her mouth and her ears and her nose to look for blood, and there wasn't any. And then she turned and she saw 16-year-old Victoria and 24-year-old Tatiana suddenly fall to the ground, just like Sasha had, except they weren't just laying there. They began rolling around and ripping their clothes off and clutching at their throats, and they're frothing at the mouth. And so Valentina reaches down to try to help Victoria, the 16-year-old, and Victoria bites her on the hand and she pulls her hand back. And then Victoria curls into a ball and then goes still. And then Tatiana begins hitting her head on a rock over and over and over again until she goes still. At this point, Valentina is in pure survival mode, and so she looks at the other two, which was 15-year-old Timur and 19-year-old Dennis. Everybody else is down on the ground at this point. And she sees Dennis is moving behind a rock, and he looks like he's not acting as erratic as everybody else. And so she starts making her way over to Dennis to see if he's going to be okay. And on the way, she sees 15-year-old Timur fall to the ground, and he's suddenly lying there still. And so she believes he's dead too. She gets over to Dennis, and he's bleeding profusely from all of his orifices in his head, but he's talking to her. And he's saying, "Okay, you need to go back to your bag, get out whatever you can that is essential, ditch the rest, and run down to the forest, and I'll meet you down there." And so Valentina says, okay. She makes her way up to her bag. She gets her sleeping bag and a couple other small items. And when she turns around to go back to Dennis, she sees that he's now slouched over his backpack, and now the blood is just pouring out of his head. And she can tell that almost certainly he's dead as well. And so not only is she all alone, she's now totally traumatized and believes whatever has happened to them is going to happen to her. And so she runs down the mountain and she goes into the forest and she gets underneath this rock overhang. She puts her sleeping bag down, she crawls inside, and she drifts in and out of consciousness for the rest of the day. And then that night, she's still laying there and the storm picked up dramatically, and she could hear all night these huge trees all over the mountain falling and slamming all around her. And so she's thinking, if I don't die from whatever killed my friends, I'm going to get hit by one of these trees. But she manages to get through the night. The next morning, the storm had cleared, and so Valentina gets up and she's thinking to herself, maybe by some miracle, one of them is still alive. And so she climbs back up the mountain to where they were, and she finds all of them still laying exactly where they were when she left them, all motionless, all deceased. And so she decides to go one by one and close each of their eyelids, and then she says her goodbye, and then she turns and kind of wanders back into the forest, where she would stay for the next 4 days, desperately walking around, hoping to be rescued at some point, the whole time just expecting to die, either from exposure, from an animal attack, from whatever killed my friends. Eventually she does hear voices and she starts making her way towards where they're coming from, and that's when she gets to the river and she sees the Ukrainian kayakers who ultimately pick her up and bring her back to town. After authorities heard Valentina's story and realized there were other hikers out there, they launched a search party, and it would take them a month to locate them. Their bodies were contorted and their faces were locked in these grimaces that looked like they were in absolute terror and agony right as they died. In addition to missing most of their clothing and their shoes, they were also all missing their eyeballs. The autopsies were only able to conclude that hypothermia contributed to their death, although it wasn't the only factor, as well as a protein deficiency, despite the fact that they had all eaten well over the course of their trip, and that all of their lungs were very bruised, but they didn't know what that was from. But nothing the autopsy concluded could reconcile what Valentina said she saw happen, which was a sudden, violent death of 6 healthy people with no signs and symptoms leading up. Suddenly, they are bleeding out of every orifice and they're falling to the ground, tearing their clothes off, grabbing at their throats, frothing at the mouth, and then dying. And whatever happened to them, why didn't it happen to Valentina? To this day, we don't really have a good answer why that happened, and the case is closed. It was ruled they mostly died of hypothermia and it was an accident, and that's that. But this isn't the first time something like this has happened in Russia. In 1959, 9 very experienced Russian hikers set off on a 16-day expedition into the Ural Mountains in the Soviet Union, and about 10 days into their hike, they reached a part where they needed to crest over this mountain before some bad weather rolled in. And they started moving up this mountain, which would be renamed the Dyatlov Pass after the leader of this group. His name is Dyatlov. They started making their way up the Dyatlov Pass, and they were going too slowly, and the weather was coming in too quickly. And so they had to make a critical decision. Stay put, but be in this totally exposed, open mountain face, much like the Hamar Daban situation where they were up on that open mountain face. Either hunker down there and get ruined by weather, and the weather was a lot worse for the Dyatlov Pass group. It was, sub-zero temperatures and just snowing ruthlessly. Or they could go down and give up ground and go down to the forest at the base of this mountain where you'd be sheltered from the storm with some trees. And so these hikers who might be a little bit overconfident in their ability decide to stick it out right on this mountain face. And over the course of that night, at some point, they cut open their tent with a knife from the inside and ran out into sub-zero temperatures, most of them not wearing shoes, not wearing jackets, not wearing pants. They're basically in underwear. And they calmly walked down the mountain all the way down to the forest. And once they got down there, 2 of them tried to desperately climb this big tree where there wasn't any low-hanging branches. And so they couldn't climb up it. We don't know what they were trying to climb up it for, but they ended up building this little tiny fire that could not have provided very much warmth at all. And they were found deceased lying around this fire. The 7 other hikers were found in 2 different areas. One that appeared to go down to that tree where those 2 were, but then doubled back and tried to get up to the campsite, but didn't make it and fell to the ground and died there. The other group was not found for a couple of weeks later. They were found at the mouth of this river. They were inside of this den, and they were wearing the clothes of the other hikers that were deceased. And the clothes they had on had traces of radiation on them. And the ones that were in the den had these devastating chest and skull injuries, and one of them was missing their eyeballs. And the official statement by the Soviet Union was they died from an unknown compelling force, which is a really mysterious way to describe how someone might die. This case was actually reinvestigated in 2020, and the new cause of death is death by avalanche, except loads of people disagree with that. In fact, experts have gone out to where this happened, and they say not only was there no avalanche, there's never been an avalanche in this area. There's literally never been one. So what do you think? Is there a connection between Hamar Daban and the Dyatlov Pass incident? Is there a cover-up in both cases where something far more sinister has happened to both groups that we don't know about? Or are they unrelated and these are just both examples of Mother Nature being far more powerful than we even realize? The next and final story of today's episode is a MrBallen fan favorite. It's called Bell's Canyon. In 2016, a 25-year-old Wall Street banker named Matt was camping near Mount Rainier in Washington state. His job was so hectic that in the rare times he got a chance to, he would disappear into the wilderness for a few days to clear his head. Despite living in one of the biggest cities in the world, Matt was actually a very competent outdoorsman, and so for this trip, he decided he would stay way off any trail deep in the backcountry in random locations. On the first night, he found a nice clearing in the trees, and so he set up his campsite there. He ate some food over his fire, he pitched his tent, climbed inside, and within a few minutes, he was fast asleep. Several hours later, Matt woke up to some strange sounds coming from outside of his tent. It sounded like a couple of animals or maybe one animal moving around right outside. And so after a while of just hearing this constant sound, he rolled over and he barely unzipped his tent flap just to look out and see if he could see whatever animal it was. And what he saw shocked him. There was a man sitting in front of his fire pit. There was no fire in his fire pit. And the guy was just sitting there with his hands on his knees, looking straight down, and periodically he would just kick his feet in the ashes of the fire pit. And Matt didn't even know what to do, so he's just looking at him through this little tiny gap in his tent. And this man all of a sudden looks up directly at Matt and makes eye contact with him. And the guy's eyes go wide, and he stands up, turns around, and runs away from Matt's campsite. Matt has no idea how to react to this, and so he just quickly unzips his tent, jumps outside, and shines his light into the forest looking for this guy. He's thinking to himself, who is this guy? I am in the middle of nowhere in the backcountry of Washington State. How long was he sitting outside there for? What does he want? And so as Matt is trying to make sense of this totally weird thing, he's thinking, okay, I'm gonna look out and I'm gonna see his flashlight somewhere, or I'm gonna see his campsite. Maybe he's set up nearby, and he's looking around into the total darkness. He's looking through all the trees, any light source anywhere out there he would see. And there's not one. There's no fire, there's no flashlight, there is nothing. And so eventually Matt goes back inside of his tent, he zips it up, and he's just left kind of dumbfounded. He can't understand how some person was just sitting outside of his tent for no apparent reason and then vanished into the forest without even turning on a flashlight. And so after a very restless night, finally the sun came up again and Matt was very relieved. He stepped outside, and after a little bit of time now from this strange incident, Matt started to tell himself that all that was is some guy happened to set up his campsite nearby. It is possible, albeit rare because we're in the backcountry, and maybe he was just intoxicated and he wandered over here, and stranger things have happened, so that's probably all it was. And so Matt felt like there was nothing to worry about. He packed up his campsite and he began hiking into the forest. Matt didn't have a planned route. Instead, he had a map and a compass, and he began just kind of wandering in the forest, kind of exploring wherever he wanted to go. And over the next 2 days, he covered at least 10, maybe 15 miles in kind of random zigzag directions. He found a nice clearing and he set up another campsite. That night, he set up a fire and he was eating some food near his fire. And then as he's sitting there, he hears rustling coming from behind him. And he's pretty sure it's an animal, so he turns around and he doesn't see anything. And he goes back to eating his food. And then a little while later, he hears some more rustling behind him. And this time he can't really just write it off. Clearly there is something behind him that's moving around. And so he stood up, turned around, and remained motionless and just listened, expecting to see maybe a deer come out of the woods. But instead, he hears a man's voice come out of the darkness that says,
"Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?"
And Matt's heart starts racing. He knows that even though he can't see him, it has to be the same guy he saw 2 days ago. Because they are in the middle of nowhere. He hasn't seen any other hikers or campers or anyone, and clearly this guy has the ability to sneak up on him. And so he's thinking, what does this guy want? I just spent the past 2 days hiking in random directions for 15 miles, and he must have followed me. And so Matt, not knowing what else to do, just says, I don't know where Bell's Canyon is. And then there's silence. And Matt, one part of him is thinking, I hope this guy does not come into the light. I hope he just goes away. The other part of him is thinking, well, maybe this is a different person that is lost and they're looking for this place called Bell's Canyon, and they'll come into the light. It'll be a big relief. I'll send them on their merry way and everything will be fine. But as Matt is having this wishful thinking, the voice from the shadows does not come any closer, but instead asks the same question, a bit more forcefully this time.
"Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?"
This time, Matt did not respond. Now he was scared. This is not some friendly hiker looking for directions. There's something wrong. And so Matt, knowing he's all alone out here, he knew he had to do something to try to take control of this situation. And so he took a deep breath, he reached down and grabbed his flashlight, and in one swift motion, he lifted his light up and shined it in the direction of this guy's voice. And what he saw was this guy from 2 days ago looking out from behind a tree right in Matt's direction. He was hiding from him. And when the light hit him, the man barked at Matt to aim it away. And Matt kind of instinctively lowered his light, but now he was too scared to raise it again, and now he knows it's the same guy. This guy has been following me for 2 days. And so for several minutes, Matt just stood there absolutely terrified, and this guy, he just stayed out there. Matt didn't hear him move. It was just a complete standstill. And then the silence was broken yet again by this voice, except somehow he had moved even closer to Matt. and when he came through asking the same question,
"Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?"
his voice was so close to Matt that Matt got scared and raised his light up, and the man was standing just a few feet away from him. And this time, the man's eyes got wide like they did the first time they saw Matt, and he turned around and he ran into the forest again. Matt, not knowing any better, just began running after him, but he only ran for about 30 seconds before he realized the terrain out here is so rough. He's gonna fall, get hurt, he's gonna get lost, and this guy's already long gone. He somehow managed to run immediately so far away, and so Matt just goes back to his campsite, and he's thinking to himself, what do? I have no cell phone service. I'm at least 3 days away from my car, and I'm in the middle of nowhere. No one even knows where I am because I didn't chart a course. I didn't tell anyone where I was gonna be. And so Matt just grabbed his knife and stood in the middle of the campsite, and for hours and hours he just kept looking around, expecting this guy to just show up again or start speaking to him from somewhere out in the darkness. It was absolutely horrifying. Finally, by about 3 in the morning, Matt was so tired that he had to go to sleep. He hadn't heard this guy again, he didn't see him again, and he figured, I need a little bit of sleep because tomorrow he's gonna pack up his campsite and begin this epic journey back to his car. And so he climbed in his tent and he had a very restless next couple of hours. When the sun came up, Matt jumped out of his tent, packed up his stuff, and began practically running in the direction of his car. All day as he was hiking, Matt kept looking over his shoulder, expecting to see this guy, because clearly he had followed him for multiple days, over 15 miles, and so the likelihood that he's still following him was really high. And so all day, Matt just felt like he was being watched, he was totally terrified, and then the sun started to go down, and Matt knew he would have to camp out again. And so he found a clearing in the trees, he set up his campsite, and he was so tired from running basically all day and being so mentally exhausted from this experience that he just got in his tent and fell asleep very quickly. But several hours later, he woke up to the sound of somebody walking around his tent. And he knew it had to be this guy. He's still in the middle of nowhere. He's not even close to the parking lot yet. And so this guy is still following him. And so Matt sat up in his tent, he clutched his knife, and for hours and hours and hours, all night, this guy just walked around his campsite. And then around 4 or 5 in the morning, he scampered off. When the sun finally came up, Matt leapt out of his tent, packed up his stuff, and literally just began running in the direction of his car, hoping that maybe he could get there before needing to camp out one more night. And so all day as he moved, he's looking over his shoulder, knowing this guy is following him. At this point, it's not even a question. He's somewhere in the forest, but he could never see him. And unfortunately, as the sun was setting, he knew he was not going to be able to make it to his car. He was just too far away. And so at some point, when it got too dark to keep moving, he had to find a clearing and set up his tent again. And so once his tent was set up, he just climbed inside, grabbed his knife, and sat there, knowing this guy was somewhere out there. And so Matt climbed inside of his tent, he zipped it up behind him, he grabbed his knife, and he sat there, expecting to hear this guy come walking around. But after several hours, he didn't hear him. And Matt started to wonder, maybe this guy has left me alone, finally. Maybe he's not following me anymore. And so Matt, who was totally exhausted, laid down to go to sleep. And then as he's laying there from somewhere out in the woods,
"Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?"
Matt immediately sat up. His heart began racing so fast that he actually was concerned he might have a heart attack. And he didn't know what to do, he didn't know what to say, so he just sat there holding his knife. And then this guy began running past his campsite, making animal sounds, and he would stop periodically and moan and grunt, and he'd kick up leaves, and then he'd run past his campsite again, over and over and over again, until the sun finally came up and this guy scampered off back into the woods. Matt didn't waste any time. He leapt out of his tent, packed his stuff up, and ran all the way back to his car. When he finally got inside of his car, shut the door, and locked it, he cried tears of joy. He was so unbelievably relieved. And he peeled out of the parking lot, he got to a nearby hotel, he finally got cell phone reception, and he considered calling the police about this guy, but he thought, what am I gonna tell them? He didn't commit a crime, he was just terrifying. And so he decided not to call the police. He finally flew back to New York, and he just had to accept that there was some strange guy out in the wilderness of Washington state who was able to hunt him over 3 days and 30 miles in rugged terrain without the use of a flashlight, without any gear. And all he ever said to Matt was,
"Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?"